impact, if you aggregate through to the next 36 months, is about 7.29. In other words, if you put $1 today, its impact on the exchange rate is as though you have put $7.3. But the peak is what is most critical. It's about 9.37. It's telling us also, if you put $1 today, the impact on the exchange rate is as though you have put $9.4 in the economy. This is a high level of sensitivity. I then asked the question, I asked myself a question, if we had these exchange rates all the way, the auction exchange rate as well as the parallel market, what would it mean if we were to empty all the shocks out of the system? So I've created time buckets, which allow you to empty all the initial shocks for the 36 months, which I've alluded to you. And you come up with a profile in red for the parallel market at 7,500, and in blue for the official auction path. Then this one is a polynomial function. It's a cubic function. So this is okay. Let me skip all that. Let me skip all that with your permission. What that means is if we empty out all the buckets of exchange rate shocks for the past 36 months, we would have been at 783 or somewhere there if we did not have all these shocks. That's basically what it means, what it is telling us. So I now go back to including the average shocks, which is the average of 7.29, multiplied by 7.83, we then think that the equilibrium exchange rate may be somewhere close to 5713.72, plus or minus. We can put a 95% confidence around that. The second question was to say, can we solve this in E-views and map a path of where the exchange rate should be over the next 24 months if we make an assumption of what is the variable we can control, which is reserve money. It seems to me that the exchange rate path, which is in red or in pink, can actually peak somewhere slightly below 6,000 and then begin to trend downwards towards a long-run equilibrium, perhaps around 3.5 in the long run. I've put those numbers there. Then what does that mean? The assumption underlying that conditional focus is that we have to deal with our reserve money path from where we are now in red towards single digit. And I've done some focus for us to think through. We have to get reserve money towards single digit if we really want the exchange rate to adjust in that direction. If we don't do that, then we will not have the exchange rate stabilizing. If we don't have the exchange rate stabilizing, we cannot control inflation. And I'm now concluding. Achieving inflation stability can only be achieved first by achieving exchange rate stability. The exchange rate movements explain over 90% of inflation. You can also look at that equation, but we can skip it as well. That explains your inflation from the exchange rate. Our inflation is over 90% exchange rate. What does that mean? It means that reserve money shocks in the presence of inflation expectations and expectations of exchange rate depreciation lead to short-run over-adjustment in the exchange rate. And the over-adjustment persists for many, many months. For us to achieve inflation stability, we must have currency and exchange rate stability. If to achieve currency and exchange rate stability, we must collapse the parallel market. To collapse the parallel market will lead to angered inflation expectations. And I propose for us the best way to achieve our reserve money targets is not really to target reserve money itself, but probably to target the Reserve Bank NTA weekly, monthly, and quarterly. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Very clear big round of applause for Joseph Mberecha. Clear presentation, articulating that significance of reserve money to our exchange rate and how that in turn has an impact on inflation. And that emphasis to say our inflation is 90% the exchange rate. And so as a monetary policy strategy going forward, we really need to look into that reserve money all the more so that we can bring down our inflation and stabilize this economy. So another big round of applause for it. So yeah, if there was someone who did not quite understand some of the things, I know we have question and answer, and he's willing to engage. Now, it could equally be an exciting presentation from Dr. Cornelius Dube. Doc is going to look at de-dollarization strategies for Zimbabwe, what literature and experience says. A round of applause for him.
Okay. Apologies for that. I asked for help from the wrong source, and unfortunately, the presentation is disappeared now. Okay, so it's back again. Thank you very much. Allow me to present from here. So instead of going all the way like what Mberecha did, I've brought my laptop here so that I can see it from here. Thank you very much. My name is Cornelius Dube. I'm making this presentation. This is a presentation of a paper that was done by the Zedcon Industrial and Economic Research Team. I've just started to mention, I know they are watching from wherever they are. I'm not trying to steal any thunder away from them. So this is a collective effort. I also want to acknowledge the comments and contributions that came from the Zedcon Economists Roundtable, who actually helped in giving comments and shaping up the paper the way it is structured. And by the way, that also includes our chairperson for this session. I also need to acknowledge that. Okay, so this paper, we are calling it de-dollarization strategies for Zimbabwe. We had been given advice that probably we should not put the word de-dollarization because it causes confusion in the market. But we just thought that we should put it there because this is the only way in which we can all begin to demystify this issue that is called de-dollarization so that no one runs away the moment that we hear the word de-dollarization. And again, this is saying de-dollarization strategy for Zimbabwe as if it is implying that somebody had said we are de-dollarizing. I'm sure the minister has always been clear that they are happy with the current multi-currency regime. We are not saying that the minister has said they are de-dollarizing. I was told that this causes panic in the market, but I'm just still going to be talking about this issue of de-dollarization. Okay. Right, if we look at our NDS1, what it says is, by 2025, we need to have a sustained market clearing exchange rate regime. And it goes on further to say, the Zimbabwe dollar should be the dominant legal tender. Currently, about, I understand now, after this paper's presentation has already been done, of course, Zimstat is now saying 80% of transactions are in USD, and 94% of banking sector loan book as of 30 June 2023 was in USD. The foreign currency deposit constitutes about 82% of money supply. So what does this mean? It means that if the NDS one is still relevant, which I am sure it is, then we need to do what we are calling de-dollarization. Remember, I said we need not run away when we say de-dollarization. I'm going to describe the context of de-dollarization, but unfortunately, it's not me. That's how de-dollarization is defined in the literature. Okay. So what we are simply saying here is that the economy needs to what? Needs to de-dollarize. Okay. The objectives of the paper, let me skip that. But now, if we are saying the economy needs to de-dollarize, what does it also mean? It also means that our economy is dollarized. Okay. So now, what's happening now? Did I not press this? Okay. So what it means that our economy is currently dollarized. And dollarization does not mean the absence of a local currency. You can be dollarized with the local currency. In other words, if you look at Zimbabwe, under that map, if you just go to that under that map, whatever definition of dollarization you can think about, we have a legally backed legislation that supports the USD. USD is operating alongside the Zimbabwe dollar. USD means of as a means of payment as well as a unit of account, and USD is also used as a store of value. Those are the definitions of what dollarization is. And Zimbabwe ticks all the boxes of those definitions. But under that dollar sign, you see that in the literature, they also say a country with a share of deposit in foreign currency of at least 10% is considered dollarized. So what it simply means that dollarization is broad, but there's a quite large window from 10% to where we are is also dollarized. If you are saying we want to completely de-dollarize, probably our share of USD deposit in total deposit should be less than 10%, which is very, very difficult to do indeed. So when they say no country has ever de-dollarized, that's not correct. Many countries have de-dollarized, but those countries that have completely de-dollarized are the ones that are probably very few. But I'm sure we'll find one or two examples of countries that have completely de-dollarized again. Okay, now, but why do we also end up having dollarization? Normally, dollarization does not come. Okay, don't worry about that. I'm going to explain this thing. I'm going to explain this one. There's a model. This model is called the minimum variance portfolio model. What it says is very simple. It says there are three variables that matter. No one forces somebody to say de-dollarize. It comes naturally. But what happens, you can define a parameter there that is called, that sign is called lambda. Lambda star, that parameter there. It's driven by three main variables. First of all is the variance in inflation itself, the volatility of inflation. And then the covariance between inflation and the real exchange depreciation, as well as the variance of the real exchange depreciation itself. It will also be interesting if one would do, because this looks all simple to do, if one would compare to what lambda star is and what our actual statistics say our dollarization level is. I'm sure somebody can do it. I'm sure we're going to find that we can easily explain dollarization based on these three main factors. But what is it saying here in this slide? It's saying it's not the absolute value of inflation that drives dollarization. By the way, when I say inflation, I'm talking about inflation of the Zimbabwe dollar. I'm not talking about blended, whether arithmetic or geometric. I'm talking about actual Zimbabwe dollar inflation. So it's not the absolute value of that inflation, but it's the volatility in that. You see the other variable there, variance of the real exchange rate depreciation, is in the denominator. So it's also saying dollarization would expect to decrease as the volatility of the real exchange rate depreciation also increases. This one I'm not trying to explain, because to me also sounds a little bit counter what I would expect. But I'm sure those in the financial sector can easily explain it for you. Okay, but why should we be worried about dollarization? I'm not saying Zimbabwe should I never said we should move from de-dollarization. I'm only saying why should we be worried about dollarization at 50%? How relevant is that when we are talking about 94% dollarization in lending? Again, so we don't need anyone to explain to us that the monetary policy transmission channel of interest rate is losing relevance under a highly dollarized environment. I'm not talking about loss of seniorage, but that's a fact. Risk of deposit run, I'm going to skip that one as well. But if you want to know more about the creation of fictitious USD balances under dollarization, you can ask our vice president. In quotes, printing the USD in the electronic system. And what ended up happening is that we had some balances which we thought we had, but we don't actually have that money. Those are also some other issues. And we're talking about reduction in efficiency of payments. I also noticed that Mishek Ugaro is here. He's the one that is always vocal about his challenges with going to the retail shop. He wants to buy something costing $1.50. You don't have 50 cents. If you give them $2, they're also not going to give you 50 cents. They will give you sweets and coupons. So again, that is the reduction in the efficiency. Okay, careful, not scaring away the markets. I know many people are watching out there. Okay, but now, once you dollarize, there's something called dollarization in hysteresis. What does it say? It says dollarization itself, the model, we saw the model previously, it can explain why we end up being dollarized. But the moment you try to address those same fundamentals that gave rise to it, it will not automatically happen. But you actually need your own. That's why we also have very few cases that manage to reduce, that completely de-dollarized. But there are a number of countries that manage to reduce their foreign currency holdings significantly as a share of total holdings. So that is the context that we are all talking about here. When we are talking about de-dollarization in Zimbabwe, I am only saying, in line with NDS 1, we need to reduce the dominance of the USD as in our total holding, either as a total of dollars can be defined from two perspectives. You can look at this credit, or you can look at it from deposits. Loans as a total share of total, USD loans as a total share of loans, or USD as a total of deposits. We are saying, if we want to meet the NDS 1 objectives, it is possible. But how? That is the question. That is actually the reason why even the chair recommended that I come here and present this paper. Okay. Now, de-dollarization itself, I've already said this, it's just a noticeable reduction in the degree of dollarization. So that can only happen if there are some significant benefits dollarization. This one we don't need anyone to explain to us. We tried it in 2020, in February 2019, and we saw we could not last even 1 year. Thanks to COVID, we managed to find a way of coming back to the USD. But we failed. That one is not only in Zimbabwe. Actually, we are going to see shortly. There's nothing, in fact, there's nothing unique about Zimbabwe, as we are going to see from here. There are so many countries that you see that problem I'm talking about Zimbabwe, I'm talking about a different country actually. So now, de-dollarization itself, it simply involves a package of macroeconomic and microeconomic. We've not yet seen deliberate efforts that are made to make the local currency more attractive to somebody compared to the USD. Then you can forget about this NDS 1 2025 object that we talked about here. So it's market-based incentive that have actually been found to be more successful in de-dollarization. This one I don't think we need anyone to explain to us. Here's one country here. This country is Bolivia. In 2002, this is deposit dollarization. 93.3% of their deposits were USD. And in 2019, they reduced this to only 13.8. If you look at today, this was even come down further, close to the 10% benchmark that we talked about. So that means Bolivia managed to do it. But how did they do it? In fact, what had caused dollarization in the first place? Various macroeconomic challenges had happened. Getting foreign capital in dollars, of course, just because the local currency was no longer any valuable. Everyone had lost confidence in it. Everyone who was doing long-term contracts, everyone who was actually getting any services, they would quote USD. So the economy ended up being dollarized along those lines. Does that sound familiar? I'm sure it does. Okay. So what did they do, Bolivia? In 1982, they just said, we only have our own currency. We can't have USD. We don't want to rely on the United States. And they introduced something that they said, from a certain period, the USD is no longer legal in this economy. All financial contracts were forcibly converted to local currency at the official exchange rate, which the market felt was not the actual rate. Also sounds familiar. Okay, so what they did, immediately when they did that, they saw huge transfers of wealth and income from creditors due to inflation. The financial system shrank, a black market for dollars emerged, and operations in dollars were not eliminated from the economy, they just went underground. So what simply happened, and now the opposition parties, political parties in Bolivia, were actually campaigning on saying, do you see what they did? They introduced, they banned the US dollar, will bring it back, and the market said, oh, these ones are talking. So what did they do? Okay. So they went back to what they are calling market-based incentives, which actually worked. So what are some of those market-based incentives? They introduced a higher mandatory reserves for foreign currency deposits compared to local currency. At least when this paper was presented, it was actually the other way. But now I understand it from the Monetary Policy Committee statement, they have now equaled the reserve ratios. But now what they did is, if you actually have higher mandatory reserves for foreign currency, you are discouraging lending of more foreign currency. So they also introduced what they are calling a Tobin. I'm just slating, you can also read other measures. I've been told here that I only have 1 minute left. So they introduced what is known as a Tobin type tax on financial transactions. So what they were doing is, in your account, in your bank account, you have USD. Where did you get the USD? If you bought them from the auction or from wherever, there's going to be 2% tax charged on you. But if you raised it from exports, that's fine. No tax is going to be raised to you. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to discourage people from changing, from buying dollars locally in the market. Am I saying this should be done? I'm saying it worked in Bolivia. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So they also introduced, they also said financial instruments, they indexed, they made deliberate efforts to make sure that financial instruments that are actually attractive for the local currency were also emerging. They also made sure that they are there. So in other words, it was not just being punished for not holding the local currency. There were also some reward, both the carrot and the stick approach, to make sure that you are just not complaining about the USD, but also see, but why should I complain about the USD anyway? And by the way, they also made sure that there was stability in the local currency, which of course is always paramount. And inflation, and I think there's also one country that has managed to do that, which is Zimbabwe. This is actually a big ground. If you want to follow, I'm not saying we should follow it. If you want to follow it, yes, stood up. Okay. If you also want, there are also other countries that did it. Argentina, Israel, we also have Angola, we also have Peru, you also, is there in measures that they used more or less like similar to what Bolivia did. But from here, you are also going to see additional one. Unfortunately, the paper is there for everyone to see. Unfortunately, the chairperson has stood up. I cannot go to that. So now probably I should do this slide, which is the last slide. I need to be talking about it, even if the chair is standing up. Okay. What lessons can we learn from this? There are a number of countries, of course. I only talked about Bolivia because I knew that the chairman was going to stand up. Although, of course, later on, I'd been given more time in the program than what I've been given here. Okay. So now, successful cases actually anchored on stable rates, inflation, exchange rate, and economic growth. And these ones I can testify that these 3 pillars we can tick even in Zimbabwe at the moment. But first, dollarization is not only in Zimbabwe that it did not work, by the way. In Bolivia, it failed. In Mexico, it failed. In Peru, it failed. In Argentina, it failed. And in Pakistan, it failed. Forced de-dollarization. Thank you. As I said, you also contributed to my being here to present me. Yes, forced de-dollarization. Yes, failed to work in those countries. But now you need different treatment of the local currency instruments compared to the dollar deposits to make it work. And of course, that also includes interest rates that are more punitive in local currency than that is. These last 3 slides I just described were just describing the current Zimbabwe situation. We had interest rates that are more punitive for the local currency than the foreign currency. So naturally, people opt for USD lending. We had a reserve requirement that was higher for local currency than foreign currency. So more foreign currency was being loaned out. We also had all taxes. In fact, if all taxes, this thing I think I'm very consistent with the CZI's position. If all taxes, if government actually, this is not only for Zimbabwe but everywhere. In Angola, that was actually very instrumental in Angola's de-dollarization journey. they made sure that all taxes are payable in local currency. Not only taxes for imports, but all taxes. They were paid in local currency. And this was just more or less like a signaling issue to say, as government, if you say we want to promote the local currency, you also need to be seen to be at the forefront in doing that.
Thank you. You know, I understand why in Parliament they will be like, order, order, comrade, because some of these presentations need to be, you know, but thank you so much for that presentation. That's relevant in terms of the targets on the Zim dollar that it has, and the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then we need to consider some of these strategies. And I think this is food for thought for possible fiscal policy input. Thank you so much, Doc, for that presentation. And I think there is some flexibility to an economy when you have your own stable store in value, which is one of the key characteristics. But if we can stabilize it and ensure that we promote it more, I think this economy can have greater flexibility. So I think, thank you for those pointers. That certainly are food for thought for policy input. Moving on to the next presentation by Sandra Mundala, focusing on monetary policy transmission, and she's from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. And I know she was taking note of some of the presentations earlier because they also feed into monetary policy. A round of applause for her as she comes.
After a jovial laughter from the presentation by Dr. Dube, I will try to be as lean as possible and not dampen your mood with my presentation, so that after this you'll be continuously laughing. I am Sandra Mundala from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, and I'll be presenting a paper on the effectiveness of monetary policy transmission in Zimbabwe under reserve money targeting in search of a new anchor. So this paper was done in collaboration with Dr. Nicholas Masiandima in absentia, and I would like to harness the point that these are views of independent researchers and do not at any point in time give an overall position of the central bank. Just a disclaimer. So moving on, I think as alluded earlier on by previous presenters, we can see that monetary policy is really a vital issue to consider. So as you are all aware, the central bank's mandate is price stability and financial stability. So against this background, we want to investigate the effectiveness of monetary policy transmission in achieving its desired goals of price and financial stability, which in turn has spillover effects in enhancing economic growth. So some of the conditions of effective monetary policy transmission include central bank independence, a well-developed and competitive financial sector, a well-functioning interbank market, and a limited and evenly distributed liquidity for use by banks. So more importantly, there is need to understand that there is need for a stable money demand which anchors a relationship between inflation expectations. So in short, I'll try to be as lean as possible. As I said, money demand is the desire of holding money, and many people hold money for different reasons. They can be transactionary, they can be precautionary, and they can be speculative. I'm sure the word speculative has been doing the rounds in Zimbabwe's economy. So moving on to the next slide, most of the effective monetary policy transmission prevailed to a limited extent. And you can see that many countries have used various anchors. And in Zimbabwe, there has been alternating use of the exchange rate and monetary-based anchors. But what has been of concern, or maybe, was the effectiveness of the current anchor of monetary targeting. And in 2022, there was a witness of a decoupling link between reserve money and its objective in achieving inflation. So maybe before I lose some of the audience, reserve money, this is the total currency in circulation of the economy plus reserves of the commercial banks held at the central bank. So the central bank has a mandate and has direct control of reserve money. So the operating target that was used was reserve money with the intermediate target, broad money. Broad money is the total money supply in the economy, and it also encompasses reserve money and other factors such as time deposits and saving deposits. So this in turn is to achieve the overall policy goal of achieving low inflation and output growth. So I hope I'm not too technical, but this is just a diagrammatic presentation of how the monetary policy transmission moves into various channels, such as the interest rate channel, the exchange rate channel, to ultimately achieve the goal of inflation, stabilization, and output growth. So in order to understand the relationship between reserve money and broad money, and velocity is the rate of circulation of money in the economy. So this is derived from the quantity theory of money, where velocity is assumed to be stable, and a direct increase in money supply is a direct implication on the prices, holding output constant. So from the technicalities that was done in the background, which my lecturer, Dr. Pindiri, said earlier on that it would take maybe a year or so to understand what would be happening in the background. So we discovered that at some point in time, the money multiplier and velocity were stable, but over time they were trending upwards, which was giving an issue to understand if reserve money targeting was still in sync with controlling inflation. So the study methodology used monthly time series data from the period 2018 to 2022, and the main variables of concern were reserve money and broad money. And we have harnessed the point that monetary targeting is premised on the assumption of a stable relationship between reserve money, broad money, which is represented by the money multiplier and velocity. So these are the equations to test for stability. And also, as alluded to earlier on by Mr. Mvereche, we also used co-integration via the vector error correction model to understand the long-run trend relationship of inflation, exchange rate, and broad money. So, so these are the recursive residuals of the money multiplier and the velocity of money, and it showed that at some point in time it was stable, but we started to notice some instability prior. You can see at the period 2020-2021. I would not dwell much into this because I might lose some of the audience, but there were some bands that were introduced and some shocks to see how money multiplier and velocity will be behaving. So in order to also understand the long-run trend relationship, as mentioned, we actually investigated if there is a long-run relationship amongst money, broad money, inflation and exchange rate. And we observed that in the long run, after inputting some non-stationarity and differencing of order one, there's some long-run trend relationship amongst these variables. So in short, or in summary, the results show that the money multiplier was unstable, and the money velocity was unstable as well. But there was existence of co-integration between broad money, inflation, and exchange rate. So as I mentioned earlier on, the research was on investigating if monetary targeting as a policy anchor has a strong link to inflation. And we observed that maybe we could look further into other implicit anchors like the exchange rate and interest rates, as well as maybe incorporate other anchors as used by regional and core international counterparts where inflation targeting is the new norm. Thank you.
Thank you. I was pleasantly surprised to see that that's the end of the presentation. Not because it's lacking in contribution, but just the conciseness and brevity. And I think she deserves a huge round of applause. And I like the way that presentation, that study, continues to fit into policy. And these are policy considerations. And I see a relationship between Mr. Mberecha's presentation and hers. And I think there is a talking together on that subject. I also see your lecturer nodding as a proud mentor who's happy that the product is doing well on the market. So, well done. Round of applause to her once again. Thank you, Sandra. Now, also from the Reserve Bank will be our last presentation before the tea break, and then we'll come back for a panel discussion. And we're looking at exchange rate pass-through to domestic inflation. And this is a presentation by Dr. Smart Manda. A round of applause for him.
Good afternoon, everyone. And allow me to say all protocols observed. My presentation is on exchange rate pass-through to domestic inflation in Zimbabwe, a research paper that was done by Nicholas Maiseyandima, myself, and Prudence Moyo. You will agree with me that exchange rate evokes emotions and has attracted so much interest in Zimbabwe. I've even seen each time you mention exchange rate, people tend to wake up because it's an issue of great interest. And I've also observed of late that many central banks are beginning to be so much interested in the exchange rate pass-through, because the empirical studies that are taking place are showing that exchange rate pass-through is becoming an essential factor in explaining inflation dynamics, particularly in small and open economies. And so, as a result, the need to quantify the magnitude by which exchange rate variations are transmitted to domestic prices has become of paramount importance. Moreover, the magnitude and speed of exchange rate pass-through are also central in the design and conduct of monetary policies. So as such, understanding the extent of exchange rate pass-through is critical to addressing the inflation scourge in many countries. But this is an empirical question that we need to look at. Now, in terms of the literature, I will not go to everything, but the point that is coming clear is that many studies are showing that exchange rate pass-through is a significant factor explaining exchange rate. I think Mr. Mberecha has already indicated that from his start, 90% of the variation in inflation is explained by exchange rate. So this is what is coming from the studies. I've also tried to look at the context in terms of what has been happening in Zimbabwe. Sorry, maybe before that, just to highlight some of the, just to highlight some of the factors that tend to affect exchange rate pass-through. You would find that in most countries, particularly developing and emerging economies, they have limited diversification in terms of their exports, which makes them vulnerable to exchange rate. Then the other issue is the over-dependence on import, which also makes it very easy for exchange rate to be transmitted into domestic inflation. And again, when countries are having, say, a higher inflation, you would find that it also The other issue is of the inflation environment, where countries that tend to have a higher inflation, you would find that they tend to have higher exchange rate pass-through. And the last point maybe that I want to raise is the limited ability by monetary and fiscal authorities to counter exchange rate shocks. This is mainly because some countries, they do not have the necessary reserves to intervene whenever they are facing high exchange rate volatilities. I think on the key literature, I had already touched on that one. I indicated that many studies are proving that exchange rate pass-through is becoming a significant factor in explaining inflation. Now, in terms of the Zimbabwean context, one of the factors that I've indicated is the lack of diversification of exports, which makes countries vulnerable to exchange rate volatilities. So if you look at our scenario, you will find that our export basket is predominantly primary products, which constitute almost 90% of our exports, which are mainly gold, tobacco, PGMs. If you look at the component of manufactured exports, it's very small compared to other. Then that line is for the imports. Here, we are looking at the correlation between inflation and exchange rate, which is very positive. You find each time there is an exchange rate movement, you will find that inflation also changes, which means there is a positive correlation between exchange rate and inflation. On this one, we are basically trying to look at the various channels of transmission of the exogenous exchange rate shocks to the economy, to inflation. I will not go to every aspect, but those are the transmission channels. Now, in terms of methodology, our challenge in Zimbabwe is that in terms of the data, you find because of the structural breaks, we don't have longer periods. If you want to study inflation, you probably want to start at 2019 when we introduced the domestic currency. But again, when you want to come to the current period, you would find that the beginning of the year, we stopped publishing inflation in Zimbabwean dollar. We started publishing a blend. And this month again, we changed. We are now publishing inflation based on the geometric mean. So because of the structural breaks, our study has been confined to the period in which inflation was mainly in domestic currency. And we have chosen to analyze it using the Bayesian VAR, which also takes into account the challenge of short periods in terms of the data requirements. And our variables are exchange rate, inflation, and money supply. Now, in terms of analyzing exchange rate pass-through, one of the important tools that is used to analyze exchange rate pass-through are the impulse responses. Here I've selected two graphs just to show the impulse response of inflation to an exchange rate shock. What the graph is basically showing is that after a one standard deviation shock on exchange rate, you find that there is a positive and a very significant response of inflation to exchange rate, which is also persistence. And I think Dr. Mbericha has also indicated that there is persistence in terms of the exchange rate shock to inflation. On this one, what we have tried to do, because we know that sometimes the official exchange rate, because it doesn't move as much as the parallel exchange rate, In our analysis, we have decided to incorporate both the official and the parallel exchange rate. And we are looking at the shock, the exchange rate shock, the inflation, the parallel exchange rate, and the official exchange rate shocks on inflation. And all these, they indicate that there is a positive relationship. But for the parallel, you find that the shock is more pronounced compared to the official exchange rate. This is more like a variance decomposition to look at the specific figures in terms of the response of inflation to shocks. So what it is basically showing is that in the first period, a shock on the official exchange rate or a one standard deviation shocks results in 0.5% movement in inflation, and which is more or less the same with money supply. When you also shock the parallel market exchange rate, you find that the shock is even, the response is even higher, reaching about 0.94, which means the parallel market exchange rate in terms of influencing inflation is much higher compared to the official, which is more or less the same as money supply. Now, having said all this, what is our story? What exactly are we saying in terms of our policy recommendations? We are saying exchange rate pass-through to domestic inflation in Zimbabwe is very significant and very fast, meaning that it's transmitted into inflation in the first period by a bigger magnitude. And when you compare to other countries, I think in the empirical literature, I cited Mozambique, which had a pass-through of 50% within the first 5 months. But you find that in Zimbabwe, the 45% is actually within the first month. And when you look at the parallel, it's actually 0.94, which is much higher. So which means the exchange rate pass-through, it's a major factor affecting inflation in Zimbabwe. So in terms of the policies, what needs to be done? I have come up with a few suggestions of what can be done in order to deal with the inflation challenge in Zimbabwe. I think from the research on effectiveness of monetary policy, it has established that the relationship between reserve money and broad money is no longer stable, making it reserve money targeting not very effective. And he has also indicated the instability of the velocity of money supply as well as the money multiplier. And in the recommendation, there was a suggestion that we need an alternative anchor that we can use. So in this regard, we are saying an explicit exchange rate target can serve the country well compared to the nominal anchors given compared to, say, reserve money targeting. The advantage of exchange rate anchor is that everyone understands it. The moment you announce that you are targeting reserve money, many people, they don't understand what it is. But the moment we say we are targeting exchange rate and we want it to be a certain level, but this does not necessarily mean you are fixing the exchange rate. When you are targeting a particular exchange rate, what it means is that, say you are targeting 5,000 is to $1. The moment you realize that the exchange rate, there is pressure for the exchange rate to depreciate against the US dollar, then you can then try to intervene so that it stays around that. Or in the event that probably you don't have enough tools to defend, you can at least allow a certain magnitude of depreciation. You may find that generally most developing countries, currencies depreciate against the US dollar, but the difference is that the level or the magnitude of depreciation for other countries is very limited. So we can as well try to ensure that when the worst happens, just a limited level of a degree of depreciation can be allowed. But while it's staying around a certain target. Then the other issue, for this to be effective, I wanted to be more pragmatic and say you also need to have, an exchange rate management committee, which probably can comprise of government, the central bank, and the private sector, who can sit to discuss what is pushing the exchange rate at a particular time, identify the necessary intervention that is required. And when you do that, it promotes transparency. And it avoids a situation where, say, the private sector thinks that probably there's printing of money when in actual fact it's not. So it promotes transparency in terms of management of exchange rate. But with all this, we are still using market mechanism to intervene in the exchange rate market. Then maybe the last point I want to make is that you also, as a country, because we are targeting exchange rate, you need probably a dedicated facility that can be used to intervene in the market whenever there is need for intervention in the market. Those are the few points that we think can be very useful in terms of managing the exchange rate pass-through in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doc, for that presentation. Articulating some of the challenges with reserve money targeting and making that proposal for the consideration of an exchange rate targeting framework. And I think the emphasis being we need to have some kind of muscle to intervene if in case we need to protect the currency. Ideally, some reserves, but if not, then some kind of facility that can achieve the same thing. So food for thought, again, relevant for policy input. Just before we break for tea, a few remarks from our chair on this subject, and then we'll have further introduction. Over to you, Prof. A round of applause for you.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremonies. So I hope we met your expectations of keeping you awake. So I think while you go for tea, I'd just like you to consider two takeaways which have come from the presentations. So the first takeaway is that a dollarized economy is not a viable long-term strategy for economic development. And the examples that Cornelius gave basically is several countries which were highly dollarized, but over a period of time, they reduced the percentage of dollars deposits, and the reason behind it he has given, so I won't repeat it. So I know we all have a great faith in the US dollar, but the reality is that we have to move toward the monocurrency. Without a monocurrency, we will never be able to have sustainable economic growth in this country. That's the bottom line. And that's what the whole economic literature tells us, and I'm afraid Zimbabwe is no exception. So we have to craft strategies to achieve the monocurrency over a period of time. And again, Cornelius gave us a package of measures which various countries have implemented, and there are lots of similarities between them, so I won't go into them. So that's one takeaway. We are dollarized, but we do have to de-dollarize, and we do have to head towards the monocurrency over a period of time. Maybe shorter, maybe longer, but certainly that is the end game, and the sooner the better. So that's one takeaway. The second takeaway is, I think all the colleagues agree, is that the question is, why are we in this situation? And they've got econometric evidence which they've produced for us. They have showed us that there is a one-to-one correlation between inflation and the exchange rate. So all the inflation that we are suffering in Zimbabwe is entirely due to the variations in the parallel market rate in the exchange rate. In addition to that, although there is some debate about what type of money is the fundamental factor behind these, the inflationary behavior in the economy, because there are different kinds of money. There's reserve money, there's broad money, etc. But in terms of the econometric evidence, there is conclusive evidence that broad money, that's total money supply, that's total liquidity, is the culprit. There's no two views about that. Money supply is the cause of our inflation. So the question is, where does this money supply come from? And I think I will leave that to the panelists to unpack. I have my own views, but I'll keep quiet for the moment. But basically, there are three sources of money supply, and I won't say more than that in any economy. So the first source of money supply is the budget deficit. If you have a fiscal deficit which is too large, it can be financed in a non-inflationary manner, but it can also be financed in an inflationary manner. So I won't comment on that. Perhaps the Honorable Finance Minister will clarify on that one later. P.S. Gumatanga, since he holds the purse string. So that's one potential source. So you will remember that some years ago during the First Republic, we had a fiscal deficit of over 15% of gross domestic product. So that is completely out of control. When you have a fiscal deficit of 15%, that means it is the fiscus, the budget, is the behavior of the government which is creating inflation. Okay? So that's one possible story. The second possible story is that it's the monetary authorities. The monetary authorities can also create money. And so we have to look at, are the monetary authorities creating money? That needs to be unpacked. Again, I leave it to the panelists. And the third potential source is, of course, the banking system, because we have a fractional reserve system. What it means that the banks with their deposits can create money. There again, the statistics are available, so one can look at whether it is excessive money creation by the banking system which is behind our inflation. So these are the three potential sources, but there is no doubt at all that liquidity, money supply is the culprit, and we have to craft strategies which limit this or eliminate it and put it at a level which will then enable us to stabilize our exchange rate, inflation, and indeed our economy. So back to the Master of Ceremonies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. I think on that note, we can go out for tea and be back by 4:10. Thank you so much. Chief Executive Officer of CVZ Holdings, Blessing Mudavani. I don't think I saw him. He's not here. Dr. Nigel Chanakira, President of the Zimbabwe Economic Society. Round of applause for him. In the absence of Mr. Mudavanu, I think I'll defer to you. We can start the discussions and open up for that question and answer. Over to you, Prof. So we'll start with you, just that overview that has been given before tea break, those inflationary pressures that the economy continues to face, and your insights on those issues. Over to you, Jimmy.
Thanks. So I just want to start by creating some context. The first thing is that whilst I may be saying some things which may come across as somewhat critical and hard-hitting, I want to say that they are in search of solutions, and that I fully appreciate that the policymakers have a really, really hard job to do. Running a country on a shoestring budget under sanctions is a really difficult job. So I acknowledge that people have been doing their best. And what we're here to do is really to see how can we do even better than what we've been doing now. The second point, which is also very, very important to point out, is that despite the challenges of inflation and exchange rate distortions that we've talked about, the underlying economy is performing exceptionally well. We all know that 2022 was a record in terms of foreign exchange receipts. That's pretty amazing when you think about the challenges of high inflation and all these other issues that we talked about, the dollarization, the distortions, and so on. So just imagine how much better the economy would perform if and when we sort these issues out. And that's exactly what Ashok was saying earlier. We could be running at double-digit growth in terms of GDP, as opposed to where we are with the single digits. So in terms of what's happening, what's driving the situation in terms of inflation, we talk that is unambiguously money supply growth. And then when you look at where is the money supply growth coming from, okay, we know that on the fiscal side, things have really been tightened up. If you look at the challenges that other countries face, let's talk about our northern neighbor, Zambia, and the arguments they are having with the IMF. They argue about subsidies, okay? We are in the very privileged position that from the fiscal side, we have essentially cleaned up the entire subsidy situation. When this administration came into being, there were numerous subsidies which were a huge drain on the fiscus. They've all been sorted out. So if we've done all that really hard work on cleaning up the fiscal, why are we having inflation of 1,000%? And the answer, in our view, and again I emphasize, we're not trying to blame people here. We are trying to find solutions. The answer, in our view, came down to the legacy liabilities of the central bank. And we know that in terms of the measures that were announced in May, this has also been acknowledged by the Ministry of Finance and that the ministry's now taken over those liabilities. So for us now, the key question to answer is, how will those be financed? Because we know that if it was that easy for them to be financed, they would have been done a long time ago. So one of the big unanswered questions which we have to answer to really bring confidence into the economy, to bring confidence into the local currency, is how are we going to finance those liabilities? So it's an opportunity now for the ministry to create transparency around that. These are the liabilities, this is the cost, this is what we're doing to reduce the cost, perhaps renegotiating some of the terms, maybe extending them so that they become more affordable. This is what we've done, this is going to be the cost, this is how it will be financed. Unfortunately, the brutal truth is it's going to probably require some additional fiscal measures, which no one's going to like, okay? But we can't get away from that. Because financing them in an inflationary way is the worst possible way to do that. Because who are the people who suffer most from inflation? It's the vulnerable people, the most vulnerable of society. You can't then finance something by hurting the most vulnerable people in your society. Everyone agrees that. No one's going to debate that. So the only other way then is you have to look at fiscal measures, unfortunately. So from a recommendations point of view, how can we be very transparent about those numbers? The second big elephant is really the use of the multi-currency system. As Ashok said very bluntly, you're not going to be able to have a successfully, highly competitive economy using a currency which is relevant to a country 5,000 miles away, with no material economic linkages with your own country. That's a fact. But what we've learned from Cornelius's work and his outstanding presentation is that you can't force that on the market. You can't force de-dollarization. Because what did he say happens when you force it? It goes underground. And who loses the most when it goes underground? It's government. So step one is really, let's make the Zimbabwe dollar desirable. Let's make it work, the incentives that he's talking about. And most importantly, you have to be able to use the Zimbabwe dollar to buy foreign exchange. You have to be able to use it freely. And as we speak today, that's still not happening. You still can't go as a willing seller and a willing buyer to a bank and negotiate, despite the fact that in de jure that's possible. It's not happening de facto. We need to sort those things out. Then a couple more points around making the Zimbabwe dollar desirable, right? The first thing is, obviously, we have to make inflation come down. You know, a friend of mine, Mucha, he always uses this analogy of a motor vehicle. If your motor vehicle is traveling at 30 kilometers an hour, it has an accident, you can predict the consequences of that accident. If you're traveling at 300, it's anyone's guess. With inflation running as high as it is in Zimbabwe, any shock, any destabilization can cause unpredictable consequences. That's why the key point is to get inflation down, make the currency desirable. And in order to do that, there are certain critical things such as, right, we need to know the actual inflation of that actual currency. Because how can you build confidence in a currency when you have a so-called blended inflation, where you are blending this inflation with another currency? How do people then know what the real buying power of that currency is? They don't. And to support that, we have to also we've got very good monetary and financial statistics published religiously by the central bank on time. But they're blended again. You've got the US dollar and the Zim dollar blended. So as an analyst, you can't analyze it. You can only estimate. If we want people to believe in the Zim dollar, let's publish the full monetary statistics of the Zim dollar, the full monetary statistics of the US dollar. And then we know, okay, This is where we stand. This is how we can build confidence. Then the last point I want to make is about this issue of sterilization, right? And liquidity management. You can't sterilize your way out of money supply growth. We've had this sterilization through NNCDs for a long time. We had it even in the previous bout of hyperinflation. We know that it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Very simply because you are taking money from a bank, but the depositor has actually got access to that money. The depositor can spend that money, and then the bank has to find a way of funding that. So in order to really deal with the issue of inflation and money supply growth, let's do away with this type of sterilization which distorts the system, hides what's really happening. No one knows how many NNCDs there are out there. Well, obviously not no one, but the market doesn't know how many NNCDs are out there. They don't know the maturity profiles. Let's move to a more orthodox money supply control where we have full transparency on the entire monetary base and how it's set up. So that way we can start to manage it properly and then reserve money targeting will start to work, by the way, because we've had that presentation which clearly shows it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because we've got these NNCDs in the mix. If you have NNCDs there, you take them away, you will be able to properly target money, and you'll be able to properly target inflation and properly bring things down. And then we can start to build confidence in the local currency, and eventually it will become the preferred medium of exchange. And we can make that happen very quickly, because we've shown what we can do in various periods, like June, July 2020. Zim dollars were very short, the currency virtually converged. July, August 2022, same thing happened. We managed liquidity, the currency is virtually converged. Run up to the election, exactly the same thing. We managed liquidity. You could walk into it, there was a period where you could walk into a bank and get foreign currency as much as you wanted. We need to get back to that, and we can do it because we've proved to ourselves that we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy, and honorable ministers who've just walked in, deputy ministers, and all distinguished guests who are here. I think I want to just pick it up where Jimmy has left off. You know, in the sense that if we're talking about the growth of money supply, and I think, Prof, you summed it up quite well, although I guess as a student of economics, I still don't have an answer with all the theory, the theoretical papers that we heard this morning, or sorry, this afternoon earlier. I think Joseph did a brilliant job in expounding and indicating to us where the exchange rate should be, and the fact that it's a trigger to the inflation rate. So it front runs, and you can run correlations, you can run econometric models, and you saw that. I love Dr. Dube presenting it in a somewhat humorous way, and yet really articulating where we are with regards to the volatility of inflation itself. And again, the underlying message in those two presentations. The Reserve Bank gentleman and lady, though, I think didn't go the full way. They kind of left me hanging, almost, Kumbirai, when you said you thought she had just started, and she stopped shy of actually telling us where the source was in terms of those monetary shocks that we had. But of course, as Prof indicated, is in the reserve money and the activity that took place around the central bank, I think, in trying to expunge those obligations somewhat. But having said that, historically we ran fiscal deficits, which are now eliminated. But there is a correlation that we're seeing in terms of the payments for contracts, which ordinarily would be funded by, not through your fiscus. Your fiscus, I think, if you don't overexpend on your recurrent expenditure, you redirect, and this is what Ministry of Finance have successfully done. They've redirected what would be ordinarily recurrent expenditure to some capital projects. Ideally, those infrastructure projects in a normal economy would then be funded externally by your soft World Bank loans, which are more long-term as such, and then also your bond market. And we've had a bond program that has been issued by the ministry, but because of the factors that must address that, when we say money supply is anywhere and everywhere, or inflation is, hyperinflation is anywhere and everywhere, a money supply factor, we must then look and say, where are the reserve money shocks coming from? And what caused them? Is it fiscal expenditure on the capital projects that meant that large amounts of money were injected into the system, and there is a local requirement in terms of expenditure by those companies, for example, on road construction or dam construction? Because there is always a domestic component. In a road, for example, 70%, it's estimated, of those costs would really be local costs that are associated with such an expenditure. So I think we need to look at that very carefully. We've seen the stock market hammered, which is your capital market, which ordinarily can also be a source of funding. It can also be a source of savings. But that hasn't taken place because of the various taxes and the limits or trading limits that have been instituted into that setup or into that market. So I think what we should be looking for are solutions. And on the solutions front, I am more interested. I think we've had numerous meetings with the Reserve Bank, for example. Jimmy, on the figures that you made mention of in terms of what's going on with the numbers in terms of reserve money. And it remains a fact that the problem, lay squarely, and impacts that were depicted by our 4 speakers today show that. Those shocks, and we must trace them down to find out exactly and precisely what the timings were and what the impacts were, if we are going to come up with a solution. And then we must move on to financial markets. Our financial markets, we had markets that worked. We had a money market system that worked, which we have not utilized, I think, to the full extent. The bonds you speak about, Jimmy, those are long-term bonds. We can plot a yield curve out of those long-term NCDs. But as you say, we don't know the maturity term. They pop up periodically in the market. People want to discount them. It's it's not a transparent market. And so the recommendations would be to the Ministry of Finance that we go on the issuance program that you've so well articulated in previous years. I'm not in favor of saying you issue it in local currency. Issue it in, in hard currency. Issue those bonds in US dollar interest rates. Let's try and get the market to subscribe to those bonds, and that includes individuals as well. Let's index them if necessary. Let's pay the saver what is due to them. So I think we've addressed lending interest rates, but we've not addressed deposit interest rates. We've not addressed financial instruments that are issued by government for any investor, so that you can sterilize any liquidity that is put into the market. I think that is well worth a shot. If we can create then a yield curve, I think we can be some way, we can go some way in that regard. We kind of went off track. I mean, we were tracking it quite clearly. You know, the COVID and the Ukraine and Russia war, you know, it triggered global inflation from a fuel, fertilizer, and food perspective. But that's petered out. And as it's petered out, we haven't seen a commensurate decline in terms of our own inflation figures as such. We credit it more to the tightening of monetary policy and its commendations in that regard. But we've got to get out of the rut now. And we can only get out of the rut if we now go out and test our markets to see how feasible they are and whether we can begin to establish some yield curves in order to foster a savings and investment culture, and then take the pressure off the equity markets and allow the money and capital markets to pick up the slack and then to move forward in that regard. I also want to then point out, as I wrap up, that if you look at global inflation and then also how it feeds into the domestic economy, we are aware that greed inflation has featured in the developed economies, where retailers and manufacturers and the logistics people never came out of the rut of the COVID, Ukraine, Russia war. And inflation, therefore, hasn't quite come down, and it's become a factor in countries like the UK. I think it's a factor that we should be addressing here in Zimbabwe. And the moves on the part of the open general import license, I think it offered respite to consumers because we saw prices stabilizing. That's another major factor. But of course, now we are seeing the consequences of that with the bankruptcies or liquidations that are taking place amongst retailers and then amongst some wholesalers. And there is a slowing down, which I know the Ministry of Industry and Commerce is now trying to address. And my hope, ministers and deputy ministers, my hope is that there's not a knee-jerk reaction to shut out that window, because it's allowed that greed inflation factor to be stemmed, and it's allowed new operators to operate and make the market more competitive. And I would argue that we're not yet at globally competitive levels, at a stage when we are actually looking at the African Free Continental Trade Area. We should be able to enable our manufacturers to compete, and to be able to compete on a price and volume basis, because that's the answer. If the manufacturing sector can be recapitalized and be allowed to access funding and produce goods in a more competitive fashion, then we are going to be more successful. The final point, Kumbi, I see you standing up. I've got a few slides on the e-procurement management system, which I would like to be put up. I think introducing an e-procurement management system is going to help us. If you can just put up the slides. I've just got 5 slides that I want to highlight. We need the e-procurement system as an inflation deterrent, both within the public sector and the private sector. That will allow the managing of tenders, the managing of live auctions, and we use AI to produce procurement processes that will allow us to allow, prices to find themselves with less intervention than we are getting. Next slide. I think if we are able to do that, we would then be readying ourselves to allow, for example, I know PRAS is going through a system or a process where there will be more e-procurement. It allows local players and regional and international players to be able to have a peep into our system. Our pricing system is very high compared to the region. And we see it, be it infrastructure, be it consumer goods, and that will render us not competitive as a country. And I think we would have a disaster if we are not allowing procurement processes to take place within government as well as within the private sector itself. Next one, just two more. I think if we can leverage on these systems, we can contain the inflationary pressures that are evident within our economy. It will allow us to allow our manufacturers and retailers to actually be able to look at warehousing systems, for example, where we bulk up in terms of supplies, we allow e-delivery within the process, and procurement takes place in a more intelligent way rather than randomly, rather than in a manner where we can't detect where prices are, so that we beat down inflation to the core and we do comparative analysis more comprehensively in terms of pricing. Next one. I mean, the corruption dimension around procurement, and this is evident not only within the public sector, but within the private sector as well. I mean, there are numerous cases where procurement has gone wrong, where people are involved, you know, on the procurement process, and we are running a cost-plus economy, whereby, I mean, whatever we acquire goods at, even non-competitively, we just add on prices to that setup. And that means that we are not competitive. We can't be competitive in a world that's going to be opening up for us. And that makes it very challenging. And so when we talk zero tolerance in both the private and public sector in terms of corruption, it's got to do with looking at pricing in a more careful way. And then I think the final slide, if there is one, you know, the presentation is there, and I'm pointing out that we need more suppliers, diversification of our supplier chain. I know within the public sector, for example, we have 12,000 suppliers that are listed by PRAS, speaking to the PRAS team, 19,000 categories of goods. That makes it quite cumbersome for us to manage in a competitive sense. And yet we've got this one big thing, inflation or margins, whichever way you might call it, that is really, if you take a look at our profit figures for our corporate entities, are we really competitive, or are we benefiting from exchange rate gains and therefore not being ultra competitive in what would be required for our companies and then our economy in general? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think, Andy, I'd like to pick your brains on this, because I know you were also in the financial services sector, worked abroad. Your input on this topic, inflation, monetary control.
Thank you very much indeed. I suppose I feel really strange being a director of ceremonies and sitting up here as a panelist. It's very weird. But anyway, I'll do it. I'll give it my best shot. Now, one of the major issues that came through very clearly is the correlation, of course, between the parallel market rate and driving of inflation. So what is very clear is the type of policies that are in place now, stifling money supply, making sure that most people in this room have some money changers number in their phone, and I don't mean that badly. Okay, so I'm hoping the police will not come and arrest you, because that's illegal, but anyway, we'll keep quiet about that. But the fact is that the parallel market rate is an evil. And we cannot operate a system in which there are different pricing structures where companies are putting up their US dollar price to meet the parallel market costs, where companies who say they want to price in US dollars, where companies are selling their products or putting their products into the downtown informal markets, they're under-invoicing, under-taxing, etc. We cannot have an economy and live a life like that. Because don't forget, we need to pay rents, we need to pay for fuel, we need to pay for other little things. Even food actually is cheaper if you pay in US dollars. And that's another issue we need to look at, I suppose, at some point, is whereby if you're down in the informal market, we did a survey at Zedcon. 5 kgs of mealie meal cost around $6, $7. In the supermarkets, downtown it costs $3. It was about 100% marked down in the informal market because, of course, they're not paying stabilize the exchange rate for a while, but that gap between the official and parallel market rate has remained where it is. Now, another question I wonder, this I suppose is a question, and it's a question I'd like to pose, I suppose, later, or the Minister of Finance or the PS and so forth can answer this. What exactly is blended inflation? Okay, I ask this because normally inflation is based on something, right? It's based on the Zimbabwe dollar, it's based on the US dollar, it's based on the pound. I've never heard of a blended Zimbabwe dollar in my life. So I'd like to understand what exactly blended inflation is and how relevant it really is in our economics and our economic growth. Because if you look at blended inflation, which is now at 70-odd%, okay, everyone keeps quiet about what Zimbabwe dollar inflation is. What is it? And unfortunately, it's interesting when you're a dollar, and so I suppose I'm posing the question to all the economists who have given us such great reports to explain to me what exact currency is being traded under blended inflation. That was my view. Now, I want to also talk about confidence, and that's very important. And I know, in a way, the presenters kind of talked about this around and around it. The fact is, we're still living our history. We still, a lot of us in this room, remember our Zim dollar. Oh, I think the thing is cut off. I think they wanted to cut me off. Sorry, guys. Right, can I? The microphone is. Is there another mic? And I know the central bank has come up with gold-backed tokens, gold-backed instruments. I think the next one is coming out now. And I think one of the things that I'll be interested to know is that they must be gold-backed. Okay. Otherwise, we're just selling an instrument which is called gold-backed. Are there gold reserves sitting at the central bank? I think that's a question that I'm sure we'll find out. Hopefully the governor can say that, because the governor says if we're issuing these gold tokens, you now should be able to go into a retail supermarket, your change, you can actually buy some of these gold-backed instruments right there. Something I'd like to know. The two other issues I'd like to just quickly and then close up on. One is the market structure. I just think that at the current exchange market, the current market structure is imbalanced. I think there's market rigidity. I think the market doesn't flow as it should do in an open market environment. I really think that there is a need to look and to understand the issues around what's happening in the marketplace. I'll give you a good example. Did you know, and I'm sure you did, that 3 banks, I think me and my good friend, market, is there one? Is there really an interbank market? Are banks really selling to each other, or are they just selling to their own customers? Which means that the rest of the other banks have no currency and basically are not trading in the forex market. Then the argument is, well, let them go and get more exporters into their books. But as we know in banking, the bigger you are, the bigger capital you have, the more clients you have, it's very difficult for smaller banks access to something. Just give me $100, $200, $300 a month, or whatever I need. And you know something? The parallel market, I think, will collapse. And that isn't happening from our research and our investigations at ZTM Prime. So I think we need to look at market inefficiencies and also to understand exactly how this interbank trading can work, which can stimulate growth, stimulate the economy, and get the currency to where it's needed the most. I think on that, I can say thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Those key questions, and we're having this conversation, this debate, and I like the point you raise about the gold coins and the implications on our gold. Reinforces what Jimmy was talking about earlier, to say if we want to build confidence in our local currency in the long term, we really need to know what the inflation for the Zimbabwe dollar is. And we saw it with the complication of the study with the Reserve Bank, that it was confined to a limited period because they couldn't accurately determine how the study was looking at the Zimbabwe dollar, because at some point we started blending. And so the veracity of the study is compromised because you don't have information about the Zimbabwe dollar, its inflation, and so on. So, yeah, those are pertinent remarks. Thank you so much. So we're opening this discussion to the floor, and I think some of our presenters that presented earlier can actually also can stand up, introduce yourself, and make your remark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mishak Ugaru, the Mishak that Dr. Cornelia spoke about. I wanted to advise him that I now get coupons, which is very strange. Instead of I refused sweets, now they give me a coupon in their name, which coupon I can't use in the next shop. So it's still a problem. However, coming to my issues, about a couple of issues. One of them is a question, and it touches on what Andy has just presented. And I think Jimmy also spoke about, we have what I actually call a mountain of foreign currency in the country. And it's unprecedented. But I think that mountain, to Andy's point, belongs to maybe 2 or 3 customers who bank with 2 or 3 banks. So my question goes on to that structure. Queries the efficacy of the foreign exchange auction. Is it working? Do we still need it? Because even if it's there, why is the mountain not moving? So the question to my panelists is, what can the authorities do to make this mountain move? Because I think it's a distribution issue. Are we also experiencing what Nigel called a greed, I don't know, pricing or greed inflation? Because definitely we have foreign currency in the country. And I think I can count 5 customers who own all of it. What about the rest of the manufacturing sector who want to upgrade their equipment? How do they access it? I don't think the auction system is answering that question. So it's a question to the panelists. Regarding money supply growth, and I think this is to my former lecturer, the Honorable Minister, I believe that the 3 scenarios that Jimmy spoke about when the currencies or the exchange rates converged, there's one characteristic: contractors were not paid. And each time it converges, then contractors get paid, including me, then the rate goes. So I would like to hear from the ministry how they can smoothen this without at the same time choking business. Because they hold the payment, then the rates converge, then they release payment, and the rates go. So to me, this is an observation that is actually happening. Lastly, I believe, and this is directed to the Honorable Minister of Industry and Commerce, we noted the instruction she gave last week, or is it this week? I would like to urge perhaps a deeper understanding or research on it, because we may react in a knee-jerk manner. I believe the wholesalers are selling to the tax shops, so-called tax shops, for a reason or 2. Number 1, they may actually own those tax shops. Number two, it is actually demand. I don't think wholesalers will stop selling if demand comes. So whilst the formal demand may show a decline, I think in total, demand is actually going up through, but the rest of it is not registered because it's going to the tax shops. So I believe we need to research a bit more and then come up with a conclusive, perhaps, solution, including a tax, I think, incentive. I call it incentive because it shouldn't be a punishment, where the wholesalers retain tax upfront, some kind of withholding structure, where the tax shops which are not paying tax are actually taxed when they get the goods from the wholesaler. And then the ministry collects that from the wholesalers. That will bring automatically the so-called informal sector into the tax base. I don't like calling it informal. I like to call it emerging sector. Thank you.
Mr. Any more contributions? Having learned from Mishek's lecture, I think perhaps to limit our contributions to one for now, and then we can give time and opportunity for others. So we have a lady there, and I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just quickly in reference to this mountain of forex in the hands of a few, I think the bigger mountain is in the hands of many, under mattresses in all sorts of caves and holes, which relates to my actual intervention about, we've heard a lot of hard statistics and formulas and models, but there are softer issues which I think will really need to be addressed in terms of issues of trust, and Andy has started to talk about this just a little bit. Past trauma, we know there's confidence. These things drive the exchange rate. They really do. And if we cannot begin to address those, it doesn't matter how strong policy is, it doesn't matter how attractive the local currency is, it is the market behavior that to a large extent drives the exchange rate. The parallel exchange rate, which does has a bearing then on the formal, because now policymakers are running to try and catch up with what's happening in what is sometimes called the real, exchange rate market. Those soft issues will need to be addressed. Thank you. And Minister, sorry, we've heard about building trust in the sector, in the financial sector, for a number of years now, but I think we now need to get to the point where serious action is taken to really address those trust and past trauma issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I like that point to say there's actually a lot more foreign currency that is not in the formal sector, because we're talking about corporates depositing their money in banks, and there are a few. But within the small-scale sector, there's a lot of forex that we need to formalize, and those trust issues come into play. Thank you so much. There's a hand here. Don't forget to introduce yourself. Standing up helps visibility on the cameras, because remember, we're recording this live on ZTN Prime. All right. Okay, that's fine.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Simba Jirauni. I'm with CBZ Bank. Yeah, the lady took some of my comments, which were, so in all these models, right, evidently, it's all summing down to Gresham's law. Good money, bad money chases away good money. Kindleberg, in his theory on booms and crashes, he speaks about exuberance, he speaks about speculation. And I think all the speakers used different models to speak to one thing, which Zimbabwe is now very much acquainted with. Zimbabwe is very much aware of. Even the person in the village now knows about exchange rate. The person in the village now knows that if I take my Zim dollars, at the end of the day, I should have liquidated them into US dollars because I want to preserve value, right? So confidence is a key factor. But even as we speak to preservation, as we speak to speculative behavior, the bottom line, and in my view, and I thought the last speaker from the Reserve Bank was going to expand it further when he spoke to the transmission effect of the exchange rate, and he started to speak to the policy issues around how to build reserves, how to build foreign currency reserves, how to increase our ability to manufacture and increase capacity for manufacturing output with respect to our our raw materials, value adding them, amplifying the value of these raw materials into value added goods, etc. that I think is something that we need to drive. That has to be the anchor of our discussions here, because when we increase reserves, when we increase the value of our capital account, we are going indirectly also addressing the pankia associated with money supply, the pankia associated with low reserves in the economy, which is chasing very little hard currency. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, MC. My name is Enmo Taruinga from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Thank you, panelists and the presenters that came before, particularly on the exchange rate and how it impacts on inflation. My question is whether the good doctors have had a chance to also look at whether the stock exchange is a source of liquidity and whether it has got an impact on the exchange rate. The reason why I ask is we have observed that there are measures that have been implemented targeting the stock market, and our question has always been, is the stock market a creator of liquidity, or it just reflects liquidity that has been created elsewhere? To the extent that what also came through when the doctors were presenting is that we seem to be punishing avenues that could then be absorbing this excess liquidity. I think the issue of the interest rates was highlighted. We have got taxes on the stock market that are currently making that a very unviable market. And the question is, are the measures informed by any study that could have probably linked the market to the liquidity that is being created? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Any other hands out there? I think we'll take you, the last one, and then I'll ask the panelists and Ministry, Reserve Bank to respond.
Good afternoon and thank you. My name is Kitu Zawanda. I'm from the Deposit Protection Corporation. And my question is, maybe I'll take you to an even softer issue to do with the ultimate beneficial shareholder we're here for, the citizen of Zimbabwe, to say with these very hard as a country. Because if we're talking about the statistics to do with unemployment and so forth, there are a lot of people out there who don't understand why things are the way they are. It's not their fault. Something like what South Africa is doing with SASSA, for instance, to say grandmother relief, you're taking care of children, there's unemployment relief in South Africa. I was actually quite less than $2,800 to be on food stamps, which means I would be on food stamps if I were in America. It's called support for poverty in Zimbabwe. I'm sorry I've taken it to that stage, but we can't be having such sophisticated government if we're not having those conversations to say how we're alleviating the problems that have come about because of inflation and the time we're taking to find a solution.
My name is Chester Mende. I'm in the accommodation business. We do houses and cemetery. I speak just as a commoner, as you can understand, of every year, when I hear that we have received $11 billion in foreign currency. And I try and translate it to where I see it in the street every day. I also hear about what are we benefiting from that $11 billion in housing. We do infrastructure, which is roads, and the main thing we appreciate building roads. We will then go and build houses. When we're building a house, most of what goes into building a house is in imports, which is in plumbing and electricity, which is no more than 30% of the cost of a house. And yet when I look at my basic reading of the national statistics, I don't seem to see government or the people that do budgeting recognizing the role that inflation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think at this stage, we will take just one more, then we
As long
get
as we keep it,
responses.
keep it succinct, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. My name is Moyo Mdamlela. I'm with the City of Victoria Falls. Mine will not be a hard one, as hard as the formulas that we saw. In lots of unsolicited bids of people who want to do projects that are not in sync with the government aspirations where we want to go. My question now is, I've heard it many times that there's funding for, what do they require for them to get access to that funding? We also get a number of unsolicited bids as a local authority that I think would benefit from this funding. So where can one get it? How does one get it? What do they have to do to get it?
These questions. Perhaps we can start with Ministry of Finance. PS, a few responses to.
Let's start by the issue of payment to contractors. The contractors have always been paid from contractors. And to align the payment model to the economy, most of the contractors are now being paid a portion in US dollars and road construction. The other contractors still get paid, like for the suppliers of other goods and services, still get paid in Zim dollars because we still have to promote the usage of Zim dollars. But the shocks were being created. Obviously, there have been instances where there were delays when we were conducting the value for money review. And there were lots of contractors who were then caught in the net. And some form of a backlog was created. But part of the backlog created from that was cleared. But there is actually a general backlog. And sometimes I've seen that the contractors have now started wanting to go to the media to say we are not being paid. But we have got payment arrangements with those contractors. And these were discussed upfront, where we looked at our cash flows and the demands that we have on our budget, and we said to the contractors, we will keep everyone, including new contractors, above water, just above water. But we have got other commitments to meet. But can you continue and let's agree on a payment plan? Because by now, most of these contractors has 2 tippers and one front-end loader. Now, because of the support from government and also their own entrepreneurship, they've managed now to have lots of this equipment. And we've said to them, look, from your costing perspective, you need some amount of the equipment, but we've already supported you to buy this equipment. Can we spread the payments? So for those who have not been paid, most of them we have got agreed and committed payment plans, which in terms of how that is going to be paid. I think there is another elephant in the room here, which has not been tackled. And I think, Mukoma Nigel, from your background, and Andy Hodges will certainly agree that at the moment, banks, at the current arrangement of the auction, banks have done the mathematics, just from the foreign currency, from the Reserve Bank and from government, banks will make a justification of a 10% margin of currency that you are sitting in your office. You don't phone anyone, you've not looked at it from any other customer. You simply go to Ramatiza Reserve Bank, Wokupa currency, and you want to charge 10% margin. I ran a treasury for 13 years. You would hardly get away with a 1%, 2% margin. 10% in the country. Because before you even start, any manufacturer, any retailer, any wholesaler, before you even start doing anything, there is a 10% Yokuma bank check. Yeah?
tisati tamboita anything else, yeah? So there's 10% yekuma bank. I think we actually need to have a complete real look at that model. Because we can always then complain and say we've got a higher cost of production, but where is some of it coming from? But the margin was 10%. Yeah? Long back if the margin was 10%. Let me come back to another very controversial issue about these tax shops versus formal retail. And there was a big retailer who went all out last week complaining. But how do you complain about a tax shop? Cash, right? Because they don't have any access to credit. Possibly they do not have a better system than what you have. And they do not have access to the cheaper foreign currency that is available in the market. They have to go to the parallel market. And you then thought I would fire you because you'll be useless management. I would fire you. In South Africa, the spaza market in South Africa is 178 billion. 178. You can go on Google now, that's the size. That's almost 10 billion US dollars in South Africa. But I've never heard ShopRite, Pick and Pay, or Checkers in South Africa complaining that they are out of business. As economies rationalize, things change. But again, you are dealing with management who only knew one thing, Mkomanajo. They only knew kuti rate inokwira and every Monday tinosangana and we change our prices as kwira mdenga. That's what they are used to. So we have got lots of FDs and MDs running these companies today who do not know what to do when an exchange rate appreciates. I've mentioned it before. If you walk into more, the rate will always go up. Right? And you sit and you reprice every day. Once the repricing stopped, you have seen the casualties. It's not the reason that they are actually putting onto the table. But those are some of the issues that we actually need to practically interrogate. Thank you.
I see that. I wish you had talked about bank charges. That would have been an interesting one. Minister?
I think I was also asked a question. I just want to amplify on the issue of procurement, value for money, and then the payment of contractors. You see, the payment of contractors, whether on time or whatever time, is a good thing. Why? Because what we've done is we've committed ourselves as a government to the public sector investment program. And that is critical for investment in economic growth. It is driving economic growth. Every government must spend money on a public sector investment program, or else it's not playing its part in supporting economic growth. This has unleashed contractors. As Gumatanga said, some of them had only got a shovel. That's all they had. And he empowered them. Now they've got serious yellow equipment everywhere. That's a good thing. So I've heard this noise about payment of contractors and so forth. This is a serious program around the public sector investment program. And payments have been smoothed out, as Gumatanga explained. Sometimes we blend between US dollar payments, Zimbabwe dollar payments, and we always watch when those blips are likely to cause challenges in the market. There will always be some errant character who escape the net and then they cause trouble in the power market. We can be sure that we are on it. Colleagues, you have to be able to fund your expectations. There's no way you can have expectations on future prices and a future exchange rate if you cannot fund it with liquidity that you have access to. So at the end of the day, liquidity is the issue. Nigel, you repeated and often said economics,
issue, truism, which is that inflation is after all a monetary phenomenon. You have to be able to fund your expectations on pricing and the exchange rate. So at the end of the day, we have to deal with liquidity. Therefore, it's not surprising that we took the unusual step, because we realized that we're dealing with an unusual situation, the step of making sure that, first of all external payments for liabilities by government, whether they are sitting in Treasury or the central bank, are paid for by Treasury, because Treasury will pay not using printed money, but money that's already in the system in the form of taxes. So there shouldn't be any growth in money supply. That's the first order of business. So we took over all the liabilities as central government to make sure that we contain the growth of this liquidity and money supply. I also wanted to check, I must say that I enjoyed those technical papers. It took me back to my previous life. Thank you very much. Looking at recursive errors, heteroscedasticity. But look, at the end of the day, the message is simple. That I agree with, I think it was the Veritas paper, that at the end of the day, the dollarization is being driven by uncertainty. The way you measure uncertainty is using the variability of inflation and the exchange rate working together in tandem. That's what pushes us towards more dollarization in a multi-currency regime, and that is correct. So I'm glad that we're able to nail it and so forth. And then the presentation from CZI, I enjoyed that thoroughly. And in fact, I want to really focus on the options that you've put on the table, because you're really saying, should we go for a big bang approach like what Bolivia did at the beginning, or a gradualist approach with a cocktail of measures? That's really what you're presenting. And you came to the conclusion that a gradual approach to de-dollarization is the way to go. But also, colleague, let me be clear. Once you allow for a multi-currency regime, where the Zim dollar, US dollar, yen, and so on, all circulate freely, if it happens that one of the currencies then ends up being dormant, it's not illegal. Because we have legalized, it's not illegal. Yes, it is unpalatable economically and so forth. And, we don't like it. It's a foreign, but it's not illegal. Let's be clear about that. So, but we want to promote our own currency. That's why we're putting all these measures and want to stabilize our own currency. We're also aware that Zimbabweans, having gone through the hyperinflation period of 2008, 2009, which led to the abandonment of our currency, there's this hysteresis effect, the impact of the past on the present. We still remember the pain and so forth. So there are people out there who say, hey, we prefer the US dollar. Also inflation is going up in US dollars, which is baffling, by the way, but there it is. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so I really enjoyed those papers, and thank you very much. But I had a question to one of the researchers, but you don't have to respond. You see, I think when you measure high-powered money, what we call M0, also you must check for the impact of what we call the non-negotiable certificates of deposit, the NNCDs, which are used as a monetary policy tool for mopping up excess liquidity from the banks, and then we lock it up in the central bank. So the issue is, how well locked up is it? Have we locked it up and thrown away the key, which is what you should do, so that it's not easy for banks then to access that liquidity. But if they're going to access it easily, then those NCDs are still part of M0. So maybe if you could just, in that paper, just throw back the NNCD balances and let me know what happens to the correlation between high-powered money and inflation. But just do that. I won't pursue that further. Now, to Andy, you asked the question, what is blended inflation? Legally, we've defined our inflation as weighted average inflation. Weighted average inflation. What are we weighing? First of all, what is inflation? This is the average, this is basically the overall general speed of change of prices across the economy. General. Because even in a monocurrency, you can have headline inflation. You've heard of that. In some countries, they will just pursue housing sector inflation. In some cases, you will pursue consumer inflation. In some cases, you will pursue producer inflation. There are different ways to measure inflation depending on the objective. Here, we're just focusing on the general. So here we are in a multi-currency regime where one currency is now more dominant. If you have 80% of your transactions in US dollars and only 20% is in Zim dollars, why do you want to ignore inflation in US dollars? So if you don't ignore it, how should you then incorporate it? How should you incorporate it? You incorporate it through a weighting average system. So we do have inflation in Zim dollars. We can give it to you. We have it. We have it. Because you cannot get to a weighted average without knowing the constituents. We will give it to you. I even said to ICAS, because they're worried about the inflation accounting, and we can give it to you. We also have US dollar inflation, but then we do a simple weighted average, 80%, 20%. You weight the two, both US dollars and that's all. That's where this weighted average is coming from. It's very simple. Now, there's a comment about, oh, even that has changed. Listen, you can average in two ways, mainly. Either you use what you call arithmetic averaging, which means that things are additive. You know where they are, and it is. Or what is geometric? Zero multiplier now. And it is. So in reality, most variables in economics are multiplicative. So mathematically, it makes sense to use geometric weighting. So we've just become more mathematically correct. That's all we've done. That's all we've done. Yeah? So mathematically correct. But it's reality. You write down, Andy, what am I US dollars guy we wanted it? So the last transactions you did, I suspect 80% of the transactions were in US dollars. So why do you want to keep harping on about US dollar inflation only? No. You did, sorry, Zim dollar inflation only, thank you. Only. No. You need both, because overall the impact on you of the general price increases is coming from both sides. That's all. So it's very logical. But if you want Zim dollar inflation, if you want US dollar inflation, I did. So there is go. I liked Nigel's presentation. I think I'm speaking too much. Nigel's presentation on e-procurement. And in fact, PSA, I've charged him with managing the value for money process with a hawk's eye, and there's been a serious hawk on it. So it is part of that process, Chanakira. I think that your services there will be really welcome to see how either working with Treasury, price, or both, we can make use of some of the technology that we are talking about. Because kuti chicken, $12. It's so expensive chicken that we consume in government. I don't know where this chicken is coming from. Bond paper is so expensive. The last time we had a whole mbudzi for breakfast each. $400 for breakfast. All of that stuff can be dealt with through e-procurement and so forth. And they have gone further. They've said, actually, we don't even need human beings. Let machines do the work. Let's use artificial intelligence. It can also do the work. And all that is very progressive. I must say, thank you for that. It opens our eyes. Let's try to I think, make use of the PS. Try to, yeah. Let me stop here for now. I've said too much.
Thank you. I did tell you that being the MC and being a panelist is dangerous. Yeah. I do have other two, could be just two things as well, which are interesting. Is one, bank charges, and whether banks should pay higher interest rates on deposits. That we can probably discuss tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So I think we'll give our panelists quick opportunity brevity.
Thanks, Kumbirai. I want to touch on the issue of the informalization of the economy. And the first thing is, let's go back to the time when the economy was effectively dollarized, from 2009 to 2015. The informal sector was still there, but they couldn't compete with your OKs, your pick and pays, because what determines pricing is buying power. And what's happened to cause the informal sector to mushroom is that the regulations have hamstrung the buying power of your big chains. Why do I say that? Because there's essentially no exchange rate control on the informal sector, but the formal sector is required to price using the formula of interbank plus 10, and their costs are related to the other market rate. So in terms of US dollars, they are completely outpriced. I can tell you right now that there's no planet on which a small tuck shop can compete with the buying power of an OK if they were going head-to-head with the same currency. But the difference right now is that your OKs are hamstrung because of the regulations. And the reality is right now, and I'm going to be very, very blunt, right? Right now, when you go to the auction, the average rate of proration is more than 50%. So despite the fact that figures are published that bids were 19.8 million and available was 20, that's not actually happening. What's happening is that the companies are getting less than 50%, right? Than of what you bid for, okay? And the reason, PS, why we don't argue with the banks with their ridiculous 10% is because they are deciding who gets and who doesn't get. So if I start to argue now with my bank and say, hang on, I want you to charge me a fair margin of 1%, how much do you think I'm going to get prorated at my bids? Yeah? So I accept the 10%. I say, thank you very much, because I need the Forex. And for willing buyer, willing seller, what's happening right now? I can take a willing seller to the bank, and they will tell me, I'm not going to trade because the rate is not right. Because the rate has to be my willing buyer, willing seller rate. Because I am not going to be accused of exchange rate manipulation. So I'm not going to put my head up and trade at 6,500 when the rest of the market is at 5,500. So therefore, take that willing seller and tell him to do something else with his money. So we need to fix the foreign exchange market. If we fix the foreign exchange market, I can tell you all these margins will disappear. Because I can then negotiate with my bank and say, no, if I don't go to you, I'll go to the next bank. But at the moment I can't because they've got the power. And we need to be really emphasize to them that no, they will not be accused of exchange rate manipulation. If they actually trade properly and report their trades, then the whole market will converge. And it's an easy fix, a really easy fix. So that's the reality. We can reverse the informalization by fixing the foreign exchange market, putting your OKs and pick and pays on a level playing field. Once they're on a level playing field, I mean, you know, do you really want to go to Resendi Street to do your shopping? No. You'd much rather shop in the nice environment of Bon Marché HCPT, so long as you get the competitive price. And once we fix the foreign exchange market, the competitive pricing will be available, and you'll see that trend reverse, and it will also benefit, obviously, tax revenue. Then the other thing I just want to touch on very, very briefly is the issue of confidence. I think one of the ladies there mentioned it. It's very critical. And I think this is where I love this idea of ZIG. Because right now, the US dollar is the store value. And I love the fact that the MPC is now insisting that there should be an independent verification. Because if we can make ZIG the store value for people who want store value, then you start to take another step towards the de-dollarization. So I really like ZIG. I think it's a potential solution to the confidence issue. As we build confidence in ZIG, that will also have a halo effect of improving confidence on the Zim dollar itself. And we can really start to build some savings in this country, build our gold reserves, and generally improve market-wide confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. A few remarks from Nigel Chanakera.
Yeah, I think I concur through you, Kumbi, that the Forex market needs to be fixed. I think that that's clear. Still, because there was a clamoring that we move away from the auction system, but I think, George, you're spot on. I mean, margins, you used to take a PIP, 0.25%, and 10% is just, it's greed inflation. And if you add the cost factors, guys, of our economy, we are going to be slaughtered. Mark my words. If we carry on trading and doing business the way we have been doing business, Zimbabwean companies will not compete. We can't. I mean, the margins that we take, this is now a volume game. If we're going to trade with barriers that are lowered. And so from that perspective, we've got to look at the entire cost structure, which is why, I'm saying that the e-procurement models apply just as well to the private sector as they do to the public sector, because there's just too much fat that's in there and less volume. And with volume comes employment. And then with employment comes, your taxes start going up and so forth. Then we have to move away from the current informal structures towards formalization. I think the one thing, though, that is, I think, imperative that we have not discussed, Minister, and we did mention it, I think, at one of the previous meetings where I participated with you and the governor. We've got a problem in the market in the sense that long-term projects with the statutory instrument that takes us to 2025 with the dollar in situ, people are not aware what's going to happen post that. And so we still have banks not issuing long-term facilities because of the uncertainty. And I think it's a quick, easy move that will actually allow us push it to 2030 for crying out loud, in terms of allowing the dollar to actually be the currency that will trade. Because I think banks are uncertain with regards to when it's going to happen. And the moment they're uncertain, it means you take out short-term credit, it's more expensive rather than what ordinarily we should be able to do. I still want to stick to the issue and emphasize the issue of developing a yield curve. The yield curve, I think, will allow the stock market some respite, because we've got just equity, an equity market without a bond market. Minister, perhaps you could address that briefly to tell us why we have not issued medium to long-term bonds so that we can actually plot a yield curve. And I can commit, Minister, I can commit to resuscitating a bond market. I think there are a couple of players, guys who have traded bonds before and placed maybe $1 billion worth of guarantees on that bond. I know you're trying to raise up to $3.5 billion. But without a long-term yield curve, I think we're stuck. So perhaps you could make a commitment that in the forthcoming budget, you will issue a program of government stocks that will allow individuals to trade with some tax incentives, small companies to trade so that it becomes a store of value. And then we go back into the international capital markets. Final point, Kadoma Declaration. And I think we should take advantage of the fact that the current president is the one whom the private sector and labor negotiated the Kadoma Declaration on. The political risk premium that is still attached to Zimbabwe has to be removed, and we have to address that. And he was the government negotiator on that one. So perhaps in your deliberations for tomorrow, you could remind him of the Kadoma Declaration. And if we can eliminate the political risk premium that is attached to Zimbabwe, then I think most of our problems would go away. Thank you.
Thanks, Judge Nagera, for those comments. Very constructive. Let me deal with the issue of the yield curve. We were determined last year to issue a government bond in US dollars. Now, initially the market told us and said, Minister, what we need to do is we need to buy some insurance on that bond. So that way we'll be able to attract both domestic investors and foreign investors. So we went out, spoke to a bank, which has a much higher credit rating, which is investment grade, compared to us as a sovereign, which is what you do. We agreed on the pricing, blah, 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 and then we're ready to issue that bond. So the same market comes back a few months later and says, two things. One, so whose risk are we really taking? The country's risk or that guarantor bank's risk? And that became an issue. Can you believe it? I thought that they would be happy with the fact that their money is even safer if we have the insurance, the guarantee. I must admit, that really surprised me. I'm sure Andrew Vumbe could articulate even this better, but let me try to summarize. So that surprised, said, okay, that's a hurdle. And then the other hurdle was around there are some investors who kept saying, you know what, you've got these restrictions and capital flows into Zimbabwe, blah, 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 sanctions and all that. So that also became an issue. So we slowed that down. But so now what we want to do now is to just issue the bonds without a guarantee. Of course, when you do that, then we have to offer a higher yield. But either way, we're still paying because that insurance wasn't free. So in fact, we even realized that, hang on, the cost of that extra insurance and the extra yield we have to pay if we're uninsured are matched. So why should we even insure? So now we've been completely unshackled. So expect us to come back to the market to issue those bonds and develop a yield curve. It's one thing that we're very, very passionate within in Treasury. We're very passionate with that. But however, there is an opportunity to move even faster. I haven't shared this with my Deputy Minister, with Gumatanga Vumbe, our head of debt. You see, we have issued bonds that the market is aware of. If I say treasury bills, short, medium, long term. Let me talk about the structure too much. I'll just say we have issued bonds. I shouldn't reveal certain secrets. To those under the blocked funds program, right? It's well known. So we've got the bonds out there already. But these are over-the-counter bonds. So there is an opportunity to get a smart investment banker. I see one banker already nodding. This is an opportunity. Approach us and just make these tradable. That's all. That's all tradable. So they are ready. Get them off Vumbe's back, you know. So that's one opportunity. We also have an opportunity, but we're still, tying down some loose ends with the farmer compensation debt. Because this again, in terms of our current proposal, is we want to issue bonds of, treasury bills of different maturities, very similar to the blocked funds. So again, that creates an opportunity for someone to take those onto the market so they're tradable and the yield curve is visible. So I just wanted to add that. The Kadoma Declaration, this pertains to the social contract later. We are onto it. We nearly signed it a few months ago. But we are approaching elections, and everyone starts postponing decisions. Look, it's as good as done. It's as good as done. We wanted to re-sign, recommit ourselves. That social contract is coming. There is convergence, and I'm the government negotiator. There is convergence between government, labor, and business. So we have no difficulty there at all. We'll get to it, but we just delayed. Everyone tries to postpone decisions around elections. That's not an issue at all. Was there a third issue? Thank you very much. The history of that, let me repeat. We have said that the multi-currency regime, its sunset is timed with the end of the NDS1 period, which is 31 December 2025. But where did that date come from? This date was requested by the private sector. In fact, I remember, I think it was Professor Chakravarti and Peter Gowata who came to my office and said, Minister, I had a problem. He said, okay, what's the problem? The private sector, sort of the banks, they don't know what to do. They're doing, issuing out loans, they're restricting lending, they're raising the price of capital because they don't know when the multi-currency regime will be abandoned or will come to an end. They need some certainty. And they proposed 31 December 2025. Is the banks, is the private sector. And as government will agree to it as usual. But now we have another issue. We're getting close to what we call a calculus situation because that date is looming. And again, the banks are saying, we can't lend because we don't know what will happen after 2025, and so forth and so forth. So we have been made aware of this, and thank you for coming back to it. We've made aware of this. We are looking into it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you, PS. Thank you, everyone, for your participation on this round. With the liberty of the chair of this session, we extended this particular discussion because it's very important. Inflation is a big issue for our economy. We need to stabilize this economy. And so it's important that we needed to get these discussions out. Now, just to conclude this session, may I ask the chair to make his concluding remarks. A round of applause for him as he comes.
Thank you, Master of Ceremonies. I have very little to say because I think the paper that money supply was the problem, and we agreed that we were going to do a diagnosis based on what the panelists are saying. And we've done that diagnosis. We found that money supply was coming not from the fiscus. We have the future budget. So the money supply was not coming from the fiscus. So that left the monetary authorities, and that also is being addressed now, and the issue of liquidity. So I won't go into the issue of liquidity and the payment to contracts because that can be a source of, he's making every effort to smoothen these payments out so that liquidity does not, there's no sudden liquidity that goes into the market to some contractors who then put that money on the parallel market. So that aspect is being dealt with. The other aspect is that these were being serviced through the creation of money supply. Again, the government is cognizant of that, and through a statutory instrument issued under presidential powers, so those liabilities have been taken in a non-inflationary manner, which is not by printing money, but raising resources, which means, unfortunately, additional resources have to be raised with different means. Look, we are under sanctions, and we have almost no recourse to the last many years, and which were being serviced by the central bank. So if they are to be funded by Treasury, there has to be increases in taxation. There's no way out of that. So additional domestic resources will have to be raised. Perhaps carbon credits and other things may help, but at the end of the day, will have to be measures to increase domestic resource mobilization. So that also is now being dealt with. So the bottom line is that we know what the causes of the inflation, those causes. So going forward, we hope that the situation on the inflation and exchange rate front will come under greater control. But I thought I'd just give you this little summary as my closing remarks. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure being with you. Just a few more announcements before we head out, that we are indeed streaming live on ZTA Prime, and we've been engaging with viewers on social media and on the live platforms. I encourage our viewers to send through their questions, and we'll ensure that those are addressed. We'd also like to advise that there's a welcome dinner being hosted this evening at 7 p.m. by the poolside. We kindly invite you all to attend. And on that note, we would like to be seated so that we can allow our VVIPs to exit. May I kindly ask our ministers, deputy ministers, so much for an engaging session. Thank you for your contribution. Dress code for tonight, smart casual.